we continue and probably conclude The Varieties of Religious Experience, a Study in Human Nature by William James, Chapter 9, Conversions. Well, they're called lectures. Dr. Starbuck gives an interesting, and it seems to me, a true account so far as conception so schematic can claim truth at all, of the reasons why self-surrender at the last moment should be so indispensable. And a lot of Eastern-centered paths really focus on that, preparing for that last moment of life event. To begin with, there are two things in the mind of the candidate for conversion. First, the present incompleteness or wrongness, the sin which he's eager to escape from, and second, the positive ideal which he longs to compass. Now, with most of us, the sense of our present wrongness is a far more distinct piece of our consciousness than is the imagination of any positive ideal we can aim at. In a majority of cases, indeed, the sin almost exclusively engrosses the attention, so that conversion is a process of struggling away from sin rather than of striving towards righteousness. And he says this in page 60, the last sentence in page 64. A man's conscious wit and will, so far as they strain towards the ideal, are aiming at something only dimly and inaccurately imagined. Yet all the while, the forces of mere organic ripening within him are going on towards their own prefigured result, and his conscious strainings are letting loose subconscious allies behind the scenes, which, in their way, work towards rearrangement, and the rearrangement towards which all these deeper forces tend is pretty surely definite, and definitely different from what he consciously conceives and determines. It may, consequently, be actually interfered with, jammed, as it were, like the lost word when we seek too energetically to recall it, by his voluntary efforts slanting from the true direction. And one of the lesser-known aspects of Goetia entity number 60 is the voluntary thing. Oh, it's fine, and it's good to do voluntary things, but don't let those voluntary things interfere with your obligations, or even one's recommendations, one could say. But your actual recommendations, your true will, as they call it in Thelema. Starbuck seems to put his finger on the root of the matter when he says that to exercise the personal will is still to live in the region where the imperfect self is the thing most emphasized, where, on the contrary, the subconscious forces take the lead. It is more probably the better self in posse which directs the operation. Instead of being clumsily and vaguely aimed at from without, it is then itself the organizing center. What then must the person do? He must relax, says Dr. Starbuck. That is, he must fall back on the larger power that makes for righteousness, which has been welling up in his own being, and let it finish in his own way the work it has begun. The act of yielding in this point of view is giving oneself over to the new life, making it the center of a new personality, and living from within the truth of it, which had before been viewed objectively. And Starbuck, page 115. Man's extremity is God's opportunity, is the theological way of putting this fact, the need of self-surrender, whilst the psychological way of stating it would be, let one do all the rest. In one's power, and one's nervous system will do the rest. Now that first and last sentence from page 113. Both statements acknowledge the same facts. To state it in terms of our own symbolism, when the new center of personal energy has been subconsciously incubated so long as just to be ready to open and flower, hands off is the only word for us. It must burst forth unaided. Now look at how that's been with society, right? True anarchy never, there was Ireland for the Teutonic or Celtic people, no. But the so-called anarchic societies, it seems that murder and rape and some other stuff was less of a thing. um, particularly since you didn't know what degree of circumstances one was going to face under. Were you going to get killed for theft, or were you going to, just get scolded for it? But you find that to some extent, Aleister Crowley is right that a lot of government interference is and society making everything too specific is why there's a problem. And you find in the Islamic world that's sort of the case too. You had a religion that everybody could follow, and then a bunch of sheikhs come in and write a bunch of books, and they make it sound like too many specifics are there for, even the normal person to even know what they are. We have used the vague and abstract language of psychology, but since in any terms the crisis described is a throwing of our conscious selves upon the mercy of powers, which, whatever they may be, are more ideal than we are actually, and make for ourselves our redemption, you see why self-surrender has always been and always must be regarded as the vital turning point of the religious life, so far as the religious life is spiritual and no other affair of outer works and ritual and sacraments. Because if all you're doing is ritual, is you're, one's just being churchy. But Islama is the Arabic term for that, and that is the. But you start with that and move your way towards the whole development and all that stuff, which with other terms, but this is not the place for that. One may say that the whole development of Christianity in inwardness has consisted in little more than the greater and greater emphasis attached to this crisis of self-surrender. From Catholicism to Lutheranism, and then to Calvinism, from that to Wesleyanism, and from this outside of technical Christianity altogether to pure liberalism or transcendental idealism, whether or not of the mind cure type, taking in the medieval mystics, the Quietists, the Pietists, and Quakers, by the way, we can trace the stages of progress towards the idea of immediate spiritual help experienced by the individual in his forlornness and standing in no essential need of doctrinal apparatus or perpetuary machinery. Now, if you look into perennial religion without this progressive ideal from the savage philosopher as largely armchair archaeologist of the 1800s were saying, we end up in a position of not having to psychologically and spiritually progress in that manner, particularly if you believe in actual revelation and inspiration in the old way of it being a spiritual thing of, here is the form being, conveyed from the spiritual worlds, and then from, you know, um, or here's the idea conveyed thereof, and things just re-emerging for the particular uh, time and place, you know. But certainly, it is the age where we don't need people secondhand conclusions, even if we can't make all that many. We don't need the secondhand conclusions with what we have. We don't need the the priesthood authority doing things for us or whatever. Maybe somebody knows more and they lead the services or something, but we don't, need their authority in the way that has been thought for tens of thousands of years. Psychology and religion are thus in perfect harmony up to this point, since both admit that there are forces seemingly outside of the conscious individual that bring redemption to his life. Nevertheless, psychology, defining these forces as subconscious and speaking of their effects as due to incubation or cerebration, implies that they do not transcend the individual's personality, and herein she diverges from Christian theology, which insists that there are direct supernatural operations of the deity. I propose to you that we do not yet consider this divergence final, but leave the question for a while in abeyance. Continued inquiry may enable us to get rid of some of the apparent discord. And so will Buddhism, right? are what people call Buddhism. I'm not Buddha and Zoroaster and Muhammad and Jesus. I don't think any of them were. It's clear that they all oppose this idea of being religious founders. So naming the faith after any of them that doesn't. Revert then for a moment more to the psychology of self-surrender. When you find a man living on the ragged edge of his consciousness, pent into his sin and want and incompleteness, and consequently inconsolable, and then simply tell him that all is well with him, and he must stop his worry, break with his discontent, and give up his anxiety, you seem to him to come with pure absurdities. The only positive consciousness he has tells him that all is not well, and the better way you offer sounds simply as if you proposed to him to assert cold-blooded falsehoods. The will to believe cannot be stretched as far as that. We must make ourselves more faithful to a belief of which we have the rudiments. But we cannot create a belief out of the whole cloth when our perception actively assures us of its opposite. The better mind proposed to us comes in that case in the form of a pure negation of the only mind we have, and we cannot actively will a pure negation. There are only two ways in which it is possible to get rid of anger, worry, fear, despair, or other undesirable affections. One is that an opposite affection should overpoweringly break up over us, and the other is by getting so exhausted with the struggle that we have to stop. So we drop down, give up, and don't care any longer. Our emotional brain centers strike work, and we lapse into a temporary apathy. Now there is a documentary proof that this state of temporary exhaustion is not infrequently forms part of the conversion crisis. So long as the egotistic worry of the sick soul guards the door, the expansive confidence of the soul of faith gains no presence. But let the former faint away, even but for a moment, and the latter can profit by the opportunity, and having once acquired possession, may retain it. Carlyle, Teufel's Drock, or is it Teufelsdrock, passes from the everlasting no to the everlasting yes through a center of indifference. Let me give you a good illustration of this feature in the conversion process. That genuine saint, David Brainerd, describes his own crisis in the following words. And Edward and Dwight's Life of Brainerd, New Haven, 1822, pages 45 to 47, abridged. One morning, while I was walking in a solitary place as usual, I at once saw that all my contrivances and projects to effect or procure deliverance and salvation for myself were utterly in vain. I was brought quite to a stand, as finding myself totally lost, I saw that it was forever impossible for me to do anything towards helping or delivering myself, that I had made all the pleas I ever could and made I ever could have made to all eternity, and that all my pleas were vain, for I saw that self-interest had led me to pray, and that I had never once prayed from any respect to the glory of God. And well, that's a first stage of realization right there, is that when you're doing the right thing and believing the right thing or whatever, if that's what you're doing, it's in your self-interest, I saw that there was no necessary connection between my prayers and the bestowment of divine mercy, that they laid not the least obligation upon God to bestow his grace upon me, and that there was no more virtue or goodness in them than there would be in my paddling with my hand in the water. I saw that I had been heaping up my devotions before God, fasting, praying, etc., pretending and indeed really thinking sometimes that I was aiming at the glory of God, whereas I never once truly intended it, but only my own happiness. I saw that, as I had never done anything for God, I had no claim on anything from him but perdition, on account of my hypocrisy and mockery, when I saw evidently that I had regarded nothing but self-interest, and that then my duties appeared a vile mockery and a continual course of lies, for the whole was nothing but self-worship and an horrid abuse of God. well, you can learn to worship in a way that is emotionally and otherwise sensually good for you. I continued, as I remember, in this state of mind from Friday morning till Sabbath evening following July 12th, 1739, when I was walking again in the same solitary place. Here, in a mournful, melancholy state, I was attempting to pray, but found no heart to engage in that or any other duty, which is sometimes the best time to do ritual, is that, oh, I don't feel like it. My former concern, exercise, and religious affections were now gone. I thought that the Spirit of God had quite left me, but still was not distressed, yet disconsolate, as if there was nothing in heaven or earth could make me happy. Having been thus endeavoring to pray, though, as I thought, very stupid and senseless, for nearly half an hour, then, as I was walking in a thick grove, unspeakable glory seemed to open to the apprehension of my soul. I do not mean any external brightness nor any imagination of a body of light, but it was a new inward apprehension or view that I had of God, such as I never had before, nor anything which had the least resemblance to it. I had no particular apprehension of any one person in the Trinity, either the Father, the Son, or the Holy Ghost, but it appeared to be divine glory. Well, personification and separation can often remove itself, you could say. My soul rejoiced with joy unspeakable to see such a God, such a glorious divine being, and I was inwardly pleased and satisfied that he should be God over all forever and ever. My soul was so captivated and delighted with the excellency of God that I was even swallowed up in him, at least to the degree that I had no thought about my own salvation, and scarce reflected that there was such a creature as myself. I continued in this state of inward joy, peace, and astonishing, till near dark, without any sensible abatement, and then began to think and examine what I had seen, and felt sweetly composed in my mind all the evening following. I felt myself in a new world, and everything about me appeared with a different aspect from what it was wont to do. At this time the way of salvation opened to me with such infinite wisdom, suitableness, and excellency, that I wondered I should ever think of any other way of salvation, was amazed that I had not dropped my own contrivances, and complied with this lovely, blessed, and excellent way before. If I could have been saved by my own duties, or any other way that I had formerly contrived, my whole soul would now have refused it. I wondered that all the world did not see and comply with this way of salvation entirely by the righteousness of Christ. And William James italicized the passage which records the exhaustion of the anxious emotions, hitherto habitual. In a large proportion, perhaps the majority of reports, the writers speak of the exhaustion of the lower and the entrance of the higher emotion as it were simultaneous. Yet, often again, they speak as if the higher activity drove the lower out. It is undoubtedly true in a great many instances, as we shall presently see, but often there seems little doubt that both conditions, subconscious ripening of the one affection and exhaustion of the other, must simultaneously have conspired in order to produce the result. And the mesocortical and the mesolimbic systems, you find that. You just don't tell yourself, don't do this or do this. You kind of work at the connections to it, too. Describing the whole phenomenon as a change of equilibrium, we might say that the movement of new psychic energies towards the personal center and the recession of old ones towards the margin, or the rising of some objects above and the sinking of others below the conscious threshold, were only two ways of describing an indivisible event. Doubtless this is often absolutely true, and Starbuck is right when he says that self-surrender and new determination, though seeming at first sight to be such different experiences, are really of the same thing. Self-surrender sees the change in terms of the old self. Determination sees it in terms of the new. And page 160 was what's referred to there, the same. And this first quote from A. Bonner, Nettleton and His Labors, Edinburgh, 1854, page 261. Well, part of this is a quote. TWB, a convert of Nettleton's, being brought to an acute paroxysm of conviction of sin, ate nothing all day, locked himself in his room in the evening in complete despair, crying aloud, "How long, O Lord, how long?" After repeating this in similar language, he said several times, I seemed to sink away into a state of insensibility. When I came to myself again, I was on my knees praying, not for myself, but for others. I felt submission to the will of God. Islam. Willing that he should do with me as should seem good in his sight. My concern seemed all lost in concern for others. And Islam teaches that, if you're praying for others, you're praying for yourself. That your needs, your wants, if they're good wants, will be supplied, well, at least in the next world, right? Because there is no wasted supplication in that sense, is that things aren't always granted in this world how we want them. They're kind of, and seeing what would be the greater case of what is granted in terms of the hereafter, one would want one's supplications granted there rather than here. But, you can want the good of here. And anyways, quote to Charles G. Finley, memoirs written by himself, 1876, page 17 and 18. Our great American revivalist, Finney, writes, I said to myself, what is this? I must have grieved the Holy Ghost entirely away. I have lost all my conviction. I have not a particle of concern about my soul, and it must be that the Spirit has left me. Why, thought I was never so far from being concerned about my own salvation in life. I tried to recall my convictions, to get back again the load of sin under which I had been laboring. I tried in vain to make myself anxious. I was so quiet and peaceful that I tried to feel concerned about that, lest it should be the result of my having grieved the Spirit away. And, well, the Holy Ghost, Holy Spirits, you could say, isn't there like 7 of them in the book of Revelation? And while there's different opinions of the names of the 7 archangels, and Gabriel's one of them, so it's, again, not a separate divinity in that book, which just presents a problem. But I can think of, the Princess of Cups worried that she didn't worry enough, right? Is that it's like I don't feel as emotional as I think I should be about not being as good of a person as we know, that I should be or something. It's been so many years, I forget, but, but beyond all question, there are persons in whom, quite independently of any exhaustion in the subject's capacity for feeling, or even in the absence of any acute previous feeling, the higher condition, having reached the due degree of energy, bursts through all barriers and sweeps in like a sudden flood. These are the most striking and memorable cases. The case of instantaneous conversion, to which the conception of divine grace has been most particularly attached. I have given one of them at length, the case of Mr. Bradley, but I had better reserve the other cases and my comments on the rest of the subject for the following lecture. Lecture 10, Conversion Concluded. And so this was actually kind of better that you kind of know when you have a couple lectures as sort of as under the same, that you know which is which. But certainly it's good for us to look and say, okay, some things are instantaneous, but we work our whole lives for them. And not just the Faustian Pact are, in modern sense, more likely to be a drug situation that for 1 or 2 experiences of the drug, they spend up their lives.